Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my videos here and footsteps to follow. I've been hesitant and delaying doing a video on Augustine, especially because Augustine is my own personal specialty, as I'm doing my PhD on Augustine's commentary on Genesis, his De Genesi ad literam. And so when you're doing a video on when I'm wanting to do a video on Augustine, it just feels like there's a lot of pressure to try to get it right. And it just feels like there's so much I want to talk about, but to try to keep the video short, it just feels overwhelming. Anyways, so I do have plans and ambitions to get a basic intro to Augustine video coming up soon. So stay tuned for that. It will happen eventually. But I've been nudged here and pushed into getting a video on Augustine's De Trinitate, his On the Trinity, because I'm going to do a review of a fun, exciting, fascinating new volume by Lux Patrum, a Diglot edition. Now, Diglot is just fancy word meaning two languages, so it's English, Latin edition, parallel together. I'm going to tell you all about this as we get through this. So here is the image of the volume that I am talking about, and I will be sharing some details about it later. So before we get into talking about this volume, I want to take a brief little bit and tell you about Augustine and the Trinity and this text that Augustine wrote, the De Trinitate, or On the Trinity. Now, just a little bit of a note that Augustine, when he's talking about the Trinity, he wasn't just doing it on his own. He wasn't just going to the Bible and figuring out the Trinity. He's an heir of tradition. Now, in addition to others, yes, he would have drawn from Origen and many others before him, but there are three specific ones that scholars recognize that were directly influence for him, that he definitely would have read these works, and they do show up in his De Trinitate treatise. The first one would be Marius Victorinus, so all of these are in the 4th century, or the 300s. So Marius Victorinus, Adversus Arium, as well as the Hilary of Poitiers De Trinitate, which I know some people who think that Hilary Poitiers De Trinitate actually is much better than Augustine's, and his should actually have the prominence that Augustine's has, but unfortunately Augustine has kind of overshadowed all of these. And then the third one, Ambrose of Milan's De Fide, or On the Faith. And um, yeah, and so these were important for Augustine, and we should see evidence that he had read these, and he kind of sits in line with a lot of them in some ways, and has his own takes in other places. Also, his De Trinitate was not his earliest nor his last exposition or latest exposition of the Trinity. In 393, he has a short treatise called Faith and the Creed, which was originally a speech that he was assigned to share with a bunch of bishops in Carthage in October of 393. And it's a nice little short English translation in the New City Press. It's about 20 pages. It's a nice, concise thing. But he's walking through the Creed from 325, the Nicene Creed, and kind of explaining the different lines. So, of course, it's very Trinitarian. Another one is his Miscellany of 83 Questions, which originated from just over a period of about 7 years, that he would have random theological conversations that stenographers recorded, and he kind of collected some of the better ones and the that he has into 83, and they're just a miscellany of different questions on various theological and biblical topics. And so specifically numbers 18, 38, 81, and 69, and a bunch of others are are a bit more focused on Trinitarian questions. There are more, and a lot of them actually tend to be a bit more focused on the Arian issues and the Homoian controversy issues that were very prominent in North Africa at this time. And something that came up a bit later, actually in this one here, is the answer to an Arian sermon would have been written actually shortly before he actually published his De Trinitate, but he would have been nearing completion of it. And so reading this text with it would be kind of, you'd see a lot of similarities. And then a little bit later is the answer to the Maximinus and Arian, and so written actually a bit closer to the end of Augustine's life, during the same time that he was writing his revisions. So now this treatise, as I said before, it tends to overshadow most others. And so when we think of early church fathers writing on the Trinity, now a lot of us tend to think about Greek fathers, Athanasius, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and others. But those are the Greek fathers. Now, I'm not saying but, those are just Greek. They're Greek treatises on the Trinity are immaculate and amazing. But when it comes to Latin fathers, Augustine kind of tends to take the full spotlight, and others end up falling in his shadow, particularly Hilary of Poitiers, who is wildly and sadly understudied, and yet is sadly understudied because it's so much rich, wonderful stuff that he's written, that he shouldn't really fall so much in the shadows there, but that's just how history has happened. So, composition of this treatise. He began writing it around 399, 400. Some scholars say as late as 404 is when he started, but the majority are going to say somewhere between 399 and 400, and that he completed it in the early 420s. Now, there were complications in writing this treatise. Augustine wanted to publish it as a completed whole, rather than releasing the books as they were completed, which is something he did with other treatises like the City of God, which is a 22-book treatise that he released in different parts. And he even talks in his City of God, he talks about having already received critical feedback from some of his opponents or critics or what have you, and he's responding to those responses even in later books of the City of God, because he published it in chunks. Whereas the De Trinitate is written in 15 books, but he wanted to hold back on publishing it until the whole thing was done so he could look back and edit it and work it all out, rather than kind of just release it in piecemeal. But unfortunately, he recounted in the year 416 that abandoning drafting his De Trinitate after some people stole the uncompleted work. He talks about this in Epistle 174, that he also asked that this epistle be prefaced with any copy of it as it went. And actually, our manuscripts, our most faithful manuscripts of the De Trinitate, and the earliest ones dating to the 8th century and later, all of them actually have, or most of them have, this epistle as a preface to it. Not an appendix, but as a preface. It is prefixed. Anyways, so he wrote that letter in the year 416. Now, some of the parts of that letter do kind of give this image as if he's actually already completed the treatise, because he is talking about sending it to his friend, but yeah, we're not sure. But a fun thing that he did note too, he even notes that there are some who only have the first 4 or 5 books of this treatise without introductions, and the 12th without the ending, which is not a small chunk. So there's a whole bunch of incomplete copies of his De Trinitate, even as early as 416, that were scattered around and being circulated. And so this was Augustine really was bothered by this, and I can totally get that. If someone were to take my dissertation as it is right now and just take it out and circulate it and publish it, well, I'm not nearly as famous enough for someone to even want to do that, but theoretically, if someone did, I would be devastated. I would not be happy with that. Anyways, so obviously Augustine wasn't. Unfortunately, we don't actually have any surviving manuscripts that we know of that actually show how the condition of these books was. It would be nice if we had. Now, about the Trinity itself, De Trinitate, I mean, I love what Rowan Williams says about it, as like, what was Augustine doing with this? What was his idea in drafting this, writing this treatise? It says, ultimately, De Trinitate is more than simply a meditation on a particular doctrine. And Augustine isn't really just trying to meditate and explain the Trinity and trying to say, this is the Trinity, and walking through that. That's not really what Augustine is doing. Rowan Williams says, it is an integral theological anthropology, a structure in which diverse doctrinal themes are woven together in an account of how human acting, desiring, and thinking come to participate in the action of God. I love this, that because that's really what we see in the De Trinitate. Like Augustine isn't actually able to explain, here is what the Trinity is, here is God, because we can't actually understand God. And that's kind of Augustine's main takeaway at the end, that we really can't understand God because of God's transcendence, that we are created, we are finite, we are limited. And in addition to all of that, we are fallen. And so, yeah, there is no way for us really to understand God until after the resurrection. And even then, the eternity is us growing in that. Now, it's probably more of Gregory of Nyssa than Augustine, but that's kind of the thing here, that he's working with. How can we understand God? What are the ways in which we can understand what is possible to understand about God? Or Edmund Hill, in his introduction, he says, Augustine is not so much talking about the Trinity as talking about how to talk about the Trinity. Now, Edmund Hill specifically is talking about what Augustine was doing in books 5 through 7, which I will explain in a second. But I think this fits through as a great summary of the whole thing, that he's not actually talking about the Trinity. It's more of a how to talk about the Trinity. What can we actually say? We really can't actually say anything direct, but we can say things indirectly. And what are they? How do we do this? So, the De Trinitate, the treatise about it. So, it was composed in 15 books. As I've talked about the difficulty and the complications with composing it, but these books, they divide well into two parts, 1 to 7 and 8 to 15, except 8 kind of functions as more of a hinge, so I should say really it's 1 to 7 and 9 through 15 with 8 as a, but you get the point. So, books 1 through 4 cover mostly exegetical issues. He's talking about like the biblical passages and taking, okay, so here's what the Bible says here and here and here, kind of bringing them all together and wrestling through ways that they seem to contradict, and there's tension here, there, and elsewhere, and figuring out, okay, how do we walk through all of this? And notably, a lot of the things he deals with are in the Old Testament. Think about the theophanies, the appearances of God, and the way God shows up in the Old Testament, including things like that are identified as the angel of the Lord or angel of Yahweh. So God speaking to Moses in the burning bush, God speaking to Abraham, and God speaking to the prophets, and so many other things. And ultimately, I find it fascinating and compelling that Augustine actually says that we can't ever say this is the Father, this specific one is the Son, this specific one is the Holy Spirit. We can't say that about any of those. The closest we can come to any of that would be God, the 3 visitors to Abraham at the Oaks of Mamre, when God announced to Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son. Isaac and Sarah laughed. And that one is only because there's 3 visitors and we know God is Trinity. And so Augustine says, that's the Trinity. But all of the others, he says, these are God speaking, but it's likely that it's God speaking through a created being. So even the burning bush, and when God spoke to Abraham, it's even identified it was an angel who did it. And he actually says that the angel of Yahweh is not a pre-incarnate Christ or the Logos, or however we look at that. It's actually, he says, it probably was just an angel, but an angel speaking on behalf of God. And he suggests that this isn't like something where, oh, we worship angels now. I'm like, no, it's not any different. He actually says it's not any different from what we read in the prophets, where a prophet will just speak God's words. And we know it's a prophet speaking God's words, that it's being mediated through the prophet. So why would we have such a problem with the notion that an angel is mediating the words here? And so it's not that the angel is worshiping. The angel is just being a vessel of mediating God's words, because God is creator. We are created. We cannot actually hear the words of God because God is eternal. God's speech is the person of the Son itself, and eternal. And there's this paradox and tension here that really is difficult to overcome. And Augustine actually approaches this in the notion of a mediating factor, that the angels are mediating this. And then, of course, the culmination of this notion of mediating that we see in the Old Testament comes to culmination and perfection in the perfect mediating role of the Logos itself, the God in the flesh, Jesus, as the now pinnacle of that revelation and the way of God being able to communicate himself, but still intermediated because Jesus is the mediator. And so it's still this mediating thing. Anyways, I'm rambling on about some fun stuff that I find fascinating about Augustine's theology. Book 5 through 7, largely dealing with issues related to the Arian controversy and other sorts of controversies. So this is where Edmund Hill talks about that. He's not really talking about the Trinity, more of talking about how. And so here's ways that are problematic with talking about the Trinity. And book 8 functions as a sort of hinge point, working between books 1 through 7 and 9 through 15, kind of directing our attention more towards the love factor, as Augustine, theologian of love. That is like really kind of a summary of Augustine here, and the like approaching how can we understand God. And so is one of the illustrations he gives is the notion of the love of self. Like we each love ourselves, we love others, we love God. And so how this relates in is this taste or image of God as Trinity that is implanted within us. And that's kind of what he then fleshes out through books 9 through 14 to exposit the way humans can possibly comprehend God as triune. And this is where we get the mental image illustration, these analogies that he uses to kind of help us think about ways to understand God, but that are still mediated and still are just images. These are not like literal realities. It's not like we are each individual trinities and things like that as God's image. That's not what being in the image of God means, because we are created. He is the creator. It just is always going to be a problem. Then book 15 is where he acquiesces to the truth that there is no way for unresurrected humanity truly to comprehend and know God outside of imperfect images. Everything is always going to be problematic and incomplete in some way because only God is perfect. And that's heresy, Patrick, right? That whole thing. Every image is going to be an analogy. Every image is always going to be heretical to some degree. And it's only helpful. That's all these are. They're helpful to kind of guide us, but really they are not the be-all end-all. Anyways, I can't talk about Augustine on the Trinity without bringing up this fun legend that possibly originated in the 12th century, in which this story was not attributed to Augustine or about Augustine, but then in the 13th century possibly was attributed to Augustine for the first time as a legend about him. So the story goes that Augustine, while he was writing his De Trinitate, was struggling with this and went out for a walk to kind of process things and think. And while he was walking out on the beach or along the shore of the Mediterranean, he encountered this child on the beach or whatever where there was a hole in the dirt, and he had a spoon, and he would run over to the sea and back to the hole, and he would fill the spoon with the water in the sea and dump it in the hole, and went back and forth and back and forth. After a while, Augustine went to the child and said, "What are you doing?" And the child said, "I am putting the sea in this hole with this spoon." And Augustine said, "This is an immense and silly task. You will never be able to complete this." And the child said, "I'll complete this long before you figure out the doctrine of the Trinity." And then the child disappeared, depending on your accounting of this. Anyways, fun story that I think is fitting for Augustine. It's one of the reasons I tell this, but obviously not an actual true story for Augustine, but a fun story that I think accurately captures Augustine's message that we really cannot understand the Trinity because we are created and God is creator. We have images and things that God has implanted in us to help us, to guide us, but they are still incomplete because they are not God himself. So access to the De Trinitate today, and I don't mean access to the Trinity as God, I mean to the text itself. How are we able to read this today? It was written like 1500 years ago, more than that. So, Latin critical texts. We do have Latin manuscripts. We have over 300 manuscripts of this text, or fragments, and many of them full, but a lot of them are fragmentary. The oldest full manuscript we have is from the 8th century, 700s. Now, there's different critical texts, different ways to access the Latin text. I'm just, for my viewers, in thinking more broadly than even just Augustine, there's a bunch of ones here for Latin works, Patrologia Latina. There's the Bibliotheca Augustine, which obviously is just Augustine works, and Corpus Scriptorum Ecclesiasticorum Latinorum, and the Corpus Christianorum Series Latina, and the Source Chrétien. Now, all of these are excellent works, and there's going to be some of Augustine's works that are not available in all of these, and all of the PL and the CSEL are both all open access, and a lot of them are public domain. The others, most of them do not have digital options, and even when they do, can cost some money. But this is just reality that we live in. The English options for the De Trinitate, Arthur West Haddan, is revised by W.G.T. Shedd, published in the Nicene Fathers series in 1887. And there's Edmund Hill's published his translation, The Works of St. Augustine, by New City Press in 1991, and it's had some light revisions and reprintings since then. Stephen McKenna has published the Fathers of the Church series, his translation in 2002. There's the Fathers of the Church, another excellent series by the Catholic University of America Press. So those are, there's basically just these three translations that are out there in English, at least. Now, this Lux Patrum edition, finally coming to it. Main focus of this video, of what I'm working towards here. So, edited by Lachlan J. Hodgson and Nathan E. Porter. This is an excellent volume. It brings Latin and the English together, puts them in parallel, so you can read the English as an Anglophone, just read the English and have the Latin there to be able to reference. So the English that's used here is the translation from 1887 by Arthur West Haddan. So yes, it is a bit of an older translation, but as Porter and Hodgson note in their preface, that it is widely recognized as a cautious and precise rendering of Augustine's Latin, in contrast to certain recent translations. And yes, I can attest to that. Now, not trying to put any negative perspectives on those translators of recent translations, but the recent translations are not as good as other works of those translators. So those translators are excellent, amazing, brilliant Augustine scholars, but this one is probably not some of their best work. The Latin text is the one published that Lux Patrum used. It's the one published by CCSL, the volume 50 from 1968, and it is the current best critical edition. Although there is rumors of a work being done of a more updated critical text, we're not really sure where that stands right now. Might come out soon. Anyways, just the fact that it's the CCSL text here, this is an incredibly valuable volume here. Well worth. Doesn't matter whatever English translation they used. The fact that the Latin text from the CCSL series is the one that's used, definitely worth it. And bringing this together as an English Latin text as parallel together brings an answer to an interesting point that Edmund Hill brought out in the introduction to his translation. Edmund Hill says this: I frankly question the value of translating ancient texts simply to serve as reference books. A mere smattering of Latin will enable the students to go to the original for reference. But to read and study and profit by a writer like Augustine, the ordinary student needs a translation with full notes and introduction. Now, I kind of agree with Edmund Hill, but the problem then is, okay, we have people with even a smattering of Latin, but how do you access the Latin text of Augustine's works? And a lot of them might only be available in the PL, the Patrologia Latina, and sometimes not. Or even just the PDF that you can find is a really smudgy scan and difficult to read. And so you don't really have the best access to it. Whereas what we have here from Lux Patrum has provided a volume that is very readable, nice, clear print with a one of the best critical Latin text here with an English translation, thus kind of circumventing Edmund Hill's critique of these older translations with minimal notes and commentary and introduction. Porter and Hodgson don't really have any introduction in their volume, but the fact that this is Latin and English kind of circumvents Hill's problems here. So I think I thought that was kind of fun to bring up. So where Edmund Hill, though, and so some of the points to bring up, he took the liberty to insert his own chapter headings and thematic divisions. Hodgson and Porter have provided at the beginning of each book the chapter headings as preserved in the CCSL text. Now, in my research on this text I was doing recently, I found out that it is possible that these chapter headings were not the interpolation of a later scribe or a monk or someone who was copying Augustine's treatise. It's possible that it was actually Augustine himself who originally drafted these exact chapter headings, or at least as best we can tell. And so Canny says in his essay that Augustine may have composed the chapter headings in the manuscripts himself. He notes Prosper of Aquitaine uses these headings in his collection of excerpts from De Trinitate in order to indicate the exact reference of his quotations. Now, Prosper of Aquitaine was a younger contemporary of Augustine, so we have evidence of these things. And Augustine himself did send a copy of the De Trinitate to Prosper, and so we have the possible evidence that these chapter headings were actually written by Augustine himself. And so the fact that Prosper uses them as a way to identify where they are indicates that he didn't just insert the headings himself, which, yeah, theoretically is possible, but that wouldn't make any sense if his aim is for others to be able to reference their versions of it. And so, or their edition, their copy. And so it suggests that even in this time when Augustine was still alive, these chapter headings were already around. So here's an image, provide some images of the actual book here so you can see for yourself. So here's just an image at the beginning of book 5 with the chapter headings there, and as you see, the Latin to the left and the English on the right. And so it's not a facing page parallels. Other volumes in Lux Patrum and a lot of other diglots tend to do the left side is the original text and the right side is English, different facing pages, whereas here we have two parallel columns, which was an interesting choice by the editors that I think did work out pretty well. And I'll show some ways that I think having it in this way actually works out to their benefit. So here you can see an example of the text. I apologize for the blurriness of the picture, but also copyrights. Go purchase the book yourself, and you can actually read this for yourself. You don't need to just sit and read just a few pictures that I have. Go and buy the book. Okay, so just kind of see how the text does line up very well in many places. But unfortunately, the reality here is that a lot of English translations, sometimes you have a Latin sentence, like one sentence in Latin might take 3 or 4 English sentences to convey what's being said there. And so a lot of the English does tend to be a lot longer, but we're also, Porter and Hodgson, we're working with an English translation that's from the late 19th century, and it was not written with being a parallel Latin English edition in mind, and so that's just the reality. And so I think Porter and Hodgson have done an amazing job with what they're working with, and theoretically can do a new English translation, but for a treatise this large, want to get it out. And we do have a public domain English translation, and that's what we're using. And it is a good English translation. It just unfortunately tends to take up a bit more space than the Latin, So there are a bunch of places where the Latin and English are very difficult to track as lining up together, but I think that's kind of a not really big issue as you're working through this. It's still, the English is very readable, and the Latin, it's not too hard for someone who has a good basic understanding of Latin. It's not hard to track with what's going on. And so here also I wanted to show you an image of the notes that they've used from they've included the notes from the Nicene Fathers volume. So you see here on the bottom left page, WGTS, that's the WGT Shed's notes from his revised notations from the Arthur West Haddan translation. And so those notations that he's included, kind of like interpretive commentary type things, those are all included. This is one of the larger notes that they've included here. So just to give you a taste of that, this is how it's included here for you to see that. Okay, and then there is one point of critique that I found in book 1, chapter 12. All of a sudden there was a section where there were no footnotes. The footnotes were skipped, and there were 8 of them that were missing. And at the end of book 1, I wrote in the ones that were missing, just so I'd still have it. And this is an easy thing to fix for any of the viewers here that want to go purchase the volume. You can go and download the PDF. This English translation is public domain, very easy to acquire. I'm going to provide a link in the description. You go there, CCEL. Christian Classics Ethereal Library is one of the best places to go to find this public domain English translation. Go download it, and you can just use that to fill in any gaps if you really need to. That's just what I did. That's where I got that information from. Anyways, so yeah, this is a minor point. It's a legitimate point of critique, but very minor, I think. So, Lux Patrum edition of the De Trinitate, kind of just the sum up here before we end the video. Diglot volumes are very difficult to produce. So even these points of critique that I brought out of how this volume kind of ends up working are very minor points, especially in light of the reality of how much work that it takes to put together Diglot, this parallel editions. So kudos to Hodgson and Porter for the work that they have done, painstakingly working through, trying to align the text as best they possibly can. You've done an amazing job. Thank you for the work that you've done. And even something I forgot to mention is the book itself. It is a bit larger, but it lays out nicely. As you notice in those pictures, I'm not holding the pages down. Through book 1, I did kind of have to pull them, but that's just at the beginning of the book. But as you get through, the book does sit open nicely on its own. Is a very handy. It is a bit larger than the average, but it's very well done. The binding, it's a glued binding, but it still is. It's flexible and works really well. It's a very high quality printing and very readable, good quality all around. Now, Diglot editions generally are commonly expensive, very expensive. If you want to purchase them from other publishers and what have you, they tend to be very expensive. And so amazing thing that Lux Patrum is doing here is providing these volumes at a very affordable price. And just a note to any viewers in Canada, I can't really comment specifically for other countries, but I do know for a fact that to purchase these volumes from the site itself, from Lux Patrum directly, is cheaper than Canadian Amazon prices. So go, if you want these volumes, which you really should, not if you do want these volumes, go to the site, purchase these volumes. There's a lot of other options. Purchase this one, and it is cheaper to get it directly from Lux Patrum's website rather than ordering through Amazon. Yes, you might get it in a day or two from Amazon, and you might have to wait a couple weeks to actually receive it if you order directly from Lux Patrum, but it is cheaper, and you're supporting their work directly rather than through Jeff Bezos. So go directly to the website. I've provided a website in the link in the description. So those even those who are lacking Latin proficiency will benefit. The English translation is amazing, and having that Latin text there is great. And it can be an encouragement for you to go and learn Latin for yourself, which I strongly encourage. And so I provided the link through Lux Patrum's website to purchase this volume in the video description. So go there, check out, click on that link and check out their website. Also, look out look at the other volumes that they already have, and they've got an amazing array of forthcoming exciting volumes. So keep an eye out for those things. So check out their other resources, well worth looking into. And also, please subscribe to this channel. Help raise awareness for what I'm doing here, the work, and more subscribers will help encourage me to keep making some more videos here. I've been lacking for some because I'm also working on my PhD to finish drafting that, finishing my dissertation, but I want to get some more videos too, so subscribe to my channel and spread the word about the work that I'm doing here with footsteps to follow. And so just a brief note of the bibliography for sources that I relied on for this video in my research, and recommended reading in general for Augustine's On the Trinity. So thank you for watching, and have a blessed day.